Beverage. Today we are going to be talking a little bit about bourbon. First, I want to go over what makes a bourbon a bourbon. While there are many nuances to call a spirit a bourbon in a legal form, I really want to talk about three. Number one, most important is the mash bill. Typically, bourbons are made up of 3 ingredients. You can add or subtract different ones, but they're always going to be made up of a mixture of corn, barley, and rye. Now, to be considered a bourbon, your mash bill has to at least be 51% corn. If it's not 51% corn, it is not considered a bourbon. It's only going to be considered a whiskey. However, you can start to play around with that mash bill and you're going to bring on different labels. So an example, Maker's Mark is a high wheated bourbon. So the majority of their mash bill is going to be that 51% corn. Their second highest ingredient in that mash bill is going to be wheat. So they're going to be considered a high wheat bourbon. You also hear a lot of people talking about high rye bourbons. Again, this Knob Creek is a rye whiskey bourbon. So that majority ingredient is going to be that corn, but then that second largest ingredient is going to be rye. Now, the second thing that I find to be super important to be a bourbon is it has to be aged in new charred American oak barrels. Couple nuances. For the Buffalo Trace, it's called a Kentucky straight bourbon. Now, if you're going to call your bourbon a straight bourbon, it has to be aged at least 2 years. This E.H. Taylor, this one has a bottled in bond label. That will also have an aging requirement. When it's considered bottled in bond, that has to be aged for a minimum of 4 years. A couple more nuances that I want to speak to. Going back to this Buffalo Trace, you see that it is specifically Kentucky straight bourbon. What that will tell you is that it was distilled and it was aged in the state of Kentucky. Now I'm going to stop for a quick second and go to our third important factor to be legally called a bourbon. This spirit has to be made and aged in the United States of America. A lot of people get this confused and think that it has to come from Bourbon County, Kentucky. That's not the case. If you want to put Kentucky straight bourbon on your label, that's when it needs to come from Kentucky. Another example, following the same guidelines, is this Hudson. This Hudson is called a New York straight bourbon whiskey. So again, we've already learned that if you're going to call it a straight bourbon, it's got to be aged for a minimum of 2 years. But if you're going to put New York on the label, that means it was distilled and it was aged all within the state of New York. So enough about the legal nuances of what can be a bourbon. And again, we can go into the factors of it's got to have a minimum proof requirement. You're not allowed to use additives. There's a slew of other things to be considered when you're calling a bourbon, but those are the 3 most important that we talk about. Now I'm going to move on and I want to show you how we make our barrel-aged old fashioned here. As you're very well aware, we make a lot of barrel-aged cocktails here at the property, and the barrel-aged old fashioned is one of our most popular ones. So I'm going to bring these off the table for just a quick second, and we're going to talk about what goes into an old fashioned. First, and arguably the most ingredient, obviously, is a bourbon. So what bourbon do you use? We love to use Smooth Ambler. We find that Smooth Ambler is a very approachable bourbon, and this is actually a blend of straight bourbons. So again, going to that keyword straight, every bourbon that's going to go into making this bottle has been aged a minimum of 2 years, but they use a blend of bourbons for this particular one. Why we like it, it's a very approachable bourbon. Nothing stands out as unbalanced from a sweet note, from a smoky note, toasty note. It's a very well-balanced bourbon. So we're going to use this for our old fashioned today. So, an old fashioned, you have 3 main ingredients. You have the bourbon. You have a sweetener. In this aspect, we're going to use 3/4 of a cup of white granulated sugar. And then you have the bitters. I'm going to pause for a quick second and let's talk about bitters. You have a slew of bitters at your fingertips. Going to any of the local stores, you have Angostura bitters, you have black walnut bitters, chocolate bitters, sassafras bitters, cherry bark bitters, the list goes on and on. If you're an experimentalist like we are, and we love the ingredients that go into everything that is food and beverage, you can also explore making your own bitters. Making your own bitters is not that difficult. First, what you need is a high proof clear spirit. You need a clear spirit that's at least gonna hit 100 proof, which is gonna be 50% alcohol. Then you're gonna need your botanicals and your spices that are gonna go in there. Now this is where you can make your own recipe up. Typically people will combine some citrus notes, whether that's a dried fruit or the rinds from an orange or a grapefruit. You can even use lime. Any citrus fruit would be a great addition to that. People add in a lot of spice notes. You could use peppercorns, you could use coriander seeds. Again, this is your recipe that you would like to make. You need a little bit of sugar to counteract that bitterness. And then the last part, and the most important part when you're making bitters, is that bittering agent. Most people, when they're making bitters, they use a root called the gentian root. You can also use worm's wood. But again, that is a recipe that you can kind of play around with and experiment what you enjoy the most. What you're gonna do is you're gonna incorporate all those ingredients into a mason jar, close it up, shake it up, and put it somewhere to sit for about 2 weeks. Every single day you need to come back to that mason jar and you need to agitate it. So put it in your pantry and every single day come back, shake that up. Next day, come shake it up. In about 2 weeks, that bitter is going to be able to start using in cocktails and see if it's hitting the notes that you want it to hit. All right, so for this old fashioned, we're gonna use our sassafras bitters. All right, so let's get started. For our barrel, we use a 3-liter charred oak barrel, and we are going to start with 3 bottles of smooth Ambler bourbon. If you're making this at home and you don't always have the time to wait for that dramatic bourbon pour, I'll show you a little trick called the tornado effect, the vortex effect. When you spin it, it speeds up a whole lot more. Next, we're gonna add our bittering agent. As I said, we use a sassafras bitters for this. And for this recipe, you're going to add 1 3/4 ounce of bitters. Last but not least, we need to add the sweetener. A good cocktail is always balanced. You're gonna have the caramelization, the heat from the bourbon, the bitterness from the bitter that's gonna hit the back of your tongue. Now we need to hit the front of the tongue, which is all sugar. So we're gonna add 3/4 cup of white granulated sugar. Nothing worthwhile is easy. This is where the labor really comes in. We need to stir this mixture, but we need to stir this until every granular of sugar is dissolved. This is gonna take a process. When we make these for the restaurants, we are stirring these by hand, as you see here, for a minimum of 15 to 20 minutes to ensure that all of that sugar is dissolved. Now we use granulated sugar as opposed to simple syrup. The reason why is we believe that simple syrup is gonna simply water down your drink. If you look at simple syrup, that is equal parts sugar and water boiled until it's dissolved. We don't wanna take away from this beautiful bourbon cocktail by adding any additional water to it, so we choose to use granulated sugar. The last piece on the container in which you're gonna use, try to make a clear container, because as you can see, I'm starting to stir here, and it's starting to dissolve, but you can clearly see in all the corners I still have sugar. That's gonna let you know when the sugar is fully dissolved, having a clear container to be able to see through. So the next thing you need to do is you need to fill it into your barrel and let it sit. Here at the property, we let it sit in these barrels for a minimum of 30 days. But this is where you get to have a little experiment. I want you to put this into that barrel and I want you to put it on the shelf and I want you to come back in 2 weeks. Maybe come back on the 3rd week. Start to taste that cocktail and find out what time frame do you think that it is fully matured and gotten as complex as you want it to be in the barrel. Now we're going to pour our barrel-aged cocktail for you to see. Garnish with a rind from an orange. Always important to express the natural citrus oils from that rind. So give it a nice squeeze around the edge. And there you have a beautiful old fashioned. Cheers.